Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Tome of Silver, the show where I randomly select a game from my collection and add it to an ever-growing ranking list. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with horror media. Usually when it comes to horror games, and especially movies, I greatly dislike when they rely too heavily on jump scares and sharp stings of music to make them scary. I'm extremely susceptible to jump scares, and I find there are really cheap ways of getting a viewer scared. I do, however, love horror books. Since you can't use jump scares or music in the book, it's up to the author to make the actual substance of the novel be scary, and when it gets that right, I love it. Basically, if the horror relies on cheap tricks, I hate it, but if the material itself is scary, then I often find myself adoring it. One day, when I was hoping to get a new game for my PlayStation Vita so I could finally blow the accumulating dust off the poor thing, I saw a review for a horror game called Deathmark, which the reviewer spoke incredibly highly of. Deciding to give it a chance, I picked up a Vita copy and gave it a try. Did it suit my particular flavor of horror? Let's turn the page and find out. Deathmark is a Japanese horror visual novel adventure game, released here in the West for PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, Nintendo Switch, and Steam. In Deathmark, we play as Kazuo Yashiki, a middle-aged man who finds a bizarre red scar resembling a bite on his wrist, though he has no idea how he got it. On his way home, he spaces out and finds himself in front of a mysterious mansion. Heading inside, he finds the owner dead, with bizarre flowers protruding from her corpse. Yashiki also finds Mary, a strange doll that is able to move and speak. Mary tells Yashiki that the owner of the mansion, Sayakujo, was investigating what she called the marks, red scars that appear on a person's body after coming in contact with a malevolent spirit. Once marked, the person starts to suffer severe memory loss, resulting in their death at dawn. Sayakujo is researching a way to stop the marks, but died before she could finish her work, and Mary warns Yashiki that he may suffer the same fate if he can't find the spirit who put the mark on him. Now, I call the protagonist Kazuo Yashiki, but that's actually just his default name the game suggests for the player. You see, the protagonist actually can't remember their name due to the memory loss effects of the mark. Mary suggests the protagonist give himself a name to call himself until his memories return. So while I called him Kazuo Yashiki, you can actually name him whatever you want, such as your own name if you prefer. This is a rather clever idea. Yashiki is very much his own character with a distinct personality, but letting the player name him due to the memory loss can still allow them to insert themselves into the role of Yashiki and feel more like they are the protagonist. The best way I can describe the story of Deathmark is that it feels like it's structured almost like a television series. See, there are 5 chapters in the game's main story, and for the most part, these chapters are pretty self-contained. Each chapter has its own unique spirit that Yashiki will need to investigate and put a stop to, alongside other people who have received a mark, who have made their way to the Kujo mansion. Each spirit's story typically starts and ends within the same chapter, with whichever mark bearer you meet during that chapter parting ways by the end. However, each chapter has hints towards the overarching story of Yashiki's mark, which does come together for a not overly grandiose, but still satisfying conclusion. I quite like the overarching mystery the story sets up, but the game's real strength comes from the individual stories it tells with each of the spirits. The spirits of Deathmark are based on urban legends and historical events in Japan, which lets each spirit stand apart from one another. It was genuinely fascinating investigating the various locations and slowly learning about each spirit, how they came to be, and what needs to be done to finally put them to rest. The spirit's story could be disturbing, grotesque, or in some cases just tragic. Not all the chapters are as good as the others. Chapter 4 definitely fell short, especially coming after the incredible Chapter 3, but each story holds their own really well. So yeah, when I think of Deathmark, I don't think of one incredible main story, but rather 5 really interesting individual stories that just happen to tie together. Being a visual novel, Deathmark relies heavily on its artwork to depict the world's characters and environments, and I'm sure that I don't need to tell you that the artwork in this game is absolutely stellar. The environments are portrayed with such detail that it's easy to get immersed as you explore the game's various locations. The game's characters are given just as much care and detail, with each character clearly standing apart from the rest with strong designs. This is of course not even taking into account the game's various event CG images, which are a real treat to see. I think if I had any gripes, it would be that each character is drawn to only have two possible expressions. The first and more common being their default expression, and the second one either being the most angry or scared you have ever seen a person be in your entire life. I understand the creation of artwork this meticulous is not easy, and no doubt takes a great deal of effort to produce. But a little more variety of expressions for each character would have been appreciated and would have gone a long way. The gameplay of Deathmark works as a point-and-click adventure game. Once you've met the mark bearers for the chapter, you set off for the location where that chapter's spirit is said to reside. You move around the location, with each room being broken up into a square, which you advance to and from, almost like a classic dungeon crawler. Things of note will have a light around them, letting you click on the object to investigate it. As you investigate, you'll find tools that you can use and notes left around that can give you useful information about the spirit or give hints on how to use certain tools to proceed. Now, during your investigation, you'll reach these sequences called Live or Die. During these moments, you'll be forced to answer these riddles, the answers of which can be found during your investigation. However, there is a time limit in the form of spirit points, which will start to count down while you choose your answer. Answering questions incorrectly will remove massive amounts of your spirit points as well, and if these points reach 0, it's game over. These sequences are great, as thoroughly investigating each location will give you plenty of hints on how to answer these questions, but the time limit adds a feeling of pressure which can make it challenging to think of the right answer. It makes each of these moments feel really tense, and makes the feeling of relief once you complete them all the more satisfying. One thing that does take away from these sequences is that should you fail them, you can choose to restart right from the beginning, so that takes away from the tension a little bit. In each chapter, you'll be introduced to 2 to 3 new mark bearers, of which you can choose one that will help you in your investigation. Each chapter takes about 1.5 to 2 hours to complete, so you don't spend too much time with each individual mark bearer. If you're hoping for a story with a lot of character development, you won't really find it here. Each character largely remains the same person from the chapter's beginning all the way to the chapter's end. However, each character has a very distinct personality, and I still grew to like them despite the short amount of time you get with each person. A nice detail is that because the characters have wildly differing personalities, they have unique comments and distinct reactions to the various situations during the investigation. So on repeat playthroughs, you can select a different character to change up the experience and get new dialogue, which is always welcome. Once you've thoroughly completed your investigation, you and your partner will be forced into a confrontation with the spirit. These encounters act almost like puzzles, as you need to use the clues you found during the investigation phase to use the right combination of tools to weaken the spirit. Once you've successfully weakened the spirit, you'll need to defeat them in one of 2 ways. The first option is to kill the spirit, the method of which is usually pretty obvious by the time you encounter the spirit. However, if you are particularly observant, then you can perform the necessary actions to put the spirit at peace. You'll want to do your best to save each spirit whenever you can, as killing the spirit outright will also result in the death of your partner, and thus stopping you from getting the good ending. I love these ghost confrontations. The music during these moments is incredibly unnerving, as you need to put all your knowledge that you've gained throughout the chapter to the test, all the while the spirit gets closer and closer to you. You will never reach these encounters without the tools to at least kill the spirit, so these moments are all about considering all the information you have and thinking carefully on how to proceed. Sometimes a specific character is needed during these encounters, but the game gives you more than sufficient hints about when this is the case. For example, if the game repeatedly tells you that the spirit despises adults, and you decide to bring the one adult partner instead of either of the 2 kids, that's just on you. Just like with the live or die sequences, it feels great using your clues to figure out the right method to defeat each spirit, and the feeling you get when you not only beat them, but see that you managed to save the spirit was incredibly fulfilling. Now, if you manage to save each spirit and get the good ending, you'll unlock a 6th bonus chapter. This chapter doesn't connect heavily to the overarching plot of the game, so if you don't manage to get the good ending on your first try and unlock this chapter, you won't miss out on any vital information. It's more of a self-contained mystery that acts like an epilogue. However, I strongly encourage unlocking this chapter. It's longer than any of the previous 5 chapters, has an incredibly unique set piece for you to investigate, and is just a genuinely fantastic short story. Now I should note that for those wanting to pick up the Vita version of this game, you'll have to buy this chapter for $10 as DLC. From what I've heard, the chapter couldn't fit on the Vita cartridge, so the game was sold $10 cheaper than the other versions of the game, so you'll ultimately be paying the same price as the other versions of the game if you decide to buy the DLC. Now I mentioned that I don't care for horror media when it relies too heavily on jump scares and tense music in order to get a scare out of the viewer. Deathmark, however, impressively avoids this trap. Much of what makes Deathmark scary outside of the spirits themselves is its masterful use of atmosphere. As you scan the environments with your flashlight, you'll occasionally catch quick glimpses of various ghosts before they vanish from sight. There's no blast of music to make these moments scary, only the implanting feeling that you don't know what's hiding behind each corner, which keeps the player on their toes. I've already made mention of how immersive the environments are visually, but the game boasts some truly strong sound design. Instead of music, the game uses environmental sounds to unnerve the player. Whether it be the soft rustling of bushes as you explore a forest, or the echoing of a war song playing in an abandoned military bunker. Deathmark greatly benefits from the use of headphones, and I strongly encourage it to engross yourself into the game. Now, I should note that its use of environmental sounds doesn't mean there isn't any music in Deathmark at all. Far from it. During the story scenes, the game has plenty of somber music accompanying them, and each track is quite excellent to listen to. I should note that Deathmark is definitely not for the faint of heart. It has very gruesome depictions of death and gore, which usually aren't present in Japanese visual novels. Deathmark also has quite a number of sequences of eroticism present, and this is probably one of my biggest grievances with Deathmark. There are a number of CG images in the game depicting women viewed from erotic angles or in sexual poses. These instances don't mesh well with the game's tone, and in almost all of these moments, the women in question were either in life-threatening situations or were just outright a corpse. These instances didn't feel sexy, they felt tasteless, usually causing me to roll my eyes and take me out of the experience. I feel removing most of these moments, spare a few which admittedly did serve a narrative purpose, would have only improved the game. Now, when it comes to translations of Japanese visual novels, they can often be hit or miss. I've played a few that were incredibly half-assed, filled with mistranslations, spelling errors, etc. I am pleased to say that Deathmark is not one of these. The game has a solid translation. There are a few spelling errors present, and some mistakes such as other characters mistakenly being given the protagonist's blue text color, but these moments are few and far between. Hardly enough to be a distraction while I was playing. What was a bit distracting were some of the car sequences. As the protagonists and the mark bearers drive from location to location, they'll occasionally engage in conversation. The way dialogue works in the game is the protagonist speaks with a blue text, while other characters' dialogue is colored with a pinkish beige. When another character is speaking, their portrait appears on screen, so you always know who is saying what. In the car, however, character portraits are not used. This usually isn't too big of a deal, since it's usually just the protagonist and one other character. However, in situations where there are more than one mark bearer in the car, it can be very difficult to tell who is talking, since each character outside of the protagonist has the same text color, and the portrait of who is speaking doesn't appear on screen. I could usually figure out who was talking by their manner of speech, but these moments were still confusing nevertheless. As is probably evident by now, I love Deathmark. Yeah, those moments of eroticism are a bit egregious, and the occasional slip-up is present. But how engaging I find the story more than makes up for these moments. This was my 3rd time playing through Deathmark, which says a lot about how much entertainment I still get from this game. The game has stunning artwork, excellent puzzles for the player to solve, and a superb sense of atmosphere. If you're a fan of horror media, I strongly encourage you to give Deathmark a look. I had to think really hard on where in the ranking to place Deathmark, and after careful deliberation, I've decided that Deathmark will claim the number 3 spot on my ranking. The fast and fluid gameplay of Resident Evil 6 makes it much easier to pop in and replay for me than Deathmark. But I love what Deathmark offers so much that it beats out its other horror contemporary, Alien Isolation. Look at that, I have a top 10 list now. Hard to believe we've entered the double digits already. So what does Chapter 11 have in store for us? Well, next time, we're going to be returning to the world of feudal Japan, but this time, we'll be hacking and slashing with some of the era's most famous figures. In the meanwhile, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and may we see each other again when we turn to the next chapter in the Tome of Silver.